Jed Stone, a man forged by the unforgiving vastness of the western plains, found his days a relentless rhythm of sun-up to sundown toil on his isolated ranch. His skin was tanned and creased like old leather, his hands permanently scarred by rope and hammer, and his eyes, a piercing blue, held the silent wisdom of endless horizons. His sole companion, and arguably his only confidant, was Dusty, a border collie whose loyalty was as unwavering as the morning star. Every evening, as the sky ignited with the fiery hues of sunset, Dusty would embark on a peculiar ritual. He'd leave the familiar comfort of the cabin porch and make his way to the river that meandered through Jed's property, a silver ribbon reflecting the fading light. There, perched on the bank, Dusty would sit, a silent, unmoving sentinel, his gaze fixed intently on the dark, brooding mass of woods on the opposite shore. This enigmatic vigil had been going on for weeks, a persistent whisper of unease in Jed's otherwise predictable life. He'd tried to dismiss it, attributing it to an animal's instinct or a curious phase, but the dog's unwavering focus, his quiet intensity, suggested something more. On a particularly sharp late autumn evening, with a sliver of moon hanging like a bone fragment in the inky sky, Jed's patience, or perhaps his comfortable solitude, finally fractured. A chill wind, carrying the scent of frost and damp earth, whistled through the gaps in his cabin walls. He watched Dusty's silhouette by the river, a dark smudge against the faint glint of water, and a decision solidified in his mind. He reached for his Winchester rifle, the familiar cool weight of the steel a reassuring presence in his calloused hand. With a determined sigh, Jed stepped out into the biting cold, resolving to uncover the secret that held his faithful companion so captive. He followed Dusty, the only sounds the crunch of his boots on frozen grass and the distant howl of a coyote, deeper into the encroaching darkness. Dusty, as if sensing Jed's intent, paused only briefly, then resumed his silent, purposeful trek towards the river's edge. Please subscribe to the channel for the next chapters of Jed's story. Jed stood on the riverbank, the chill from the water seeping into his boots, his eyes straining against the oppressive gloom. He scoured the tree line across the narrow, winding river, searching for any flicker of light, any unnatural shadow that might explain Dusty's fascination, but there was nothing. Just the daunting, monolithic silhouette of the forest pressing against the starless sky. He called Dusty, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. The dog, usually quick to obey, seemed rooted to the spot, his entire body a taut line of anticipation, his gaze locked on a particular, indistinct area deeper within the woods. It was an unusual show of disobedience, confirming Jed's gut feeling that something was genuinely amiss. Finally, with a soft whine, Dusty turned and followed Jed back towards the distant glow of the cabin's lantern. Back inside, the warmth of the small stove did little to thaw the unease that had settled deep in Jed's bones. He'd lived in these remote parts for over 2 decades, relying on instinct and observation to survive. He knew the land, its rhythms, and its subtle secrets. Dusty's unwavering focus on the other side of the river wasn't a mere whim. It was a silent, persistent signal. The next morning, as the first pale light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Jed saddled his old mare, Bess. The air was crisp, biting at his exposed skin, and the ground crunched under Bess's hooves as they moved. He rode slowly along his side of the river, his eyes meticulously scanning the opposite bank. He tried to pinpoint the exact spot that had captivated Dusty night after night. About a mile upstream, where the river curved sharply, he noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible trail. It wasn't a deer path or a natural game trail. It was too straight, too deliberately worn. The leaves and pine needles along its edges looked disturbed, recently trampled. A jolt of realization, mixed with a growing sense of foreboding, shot through him. Someone, or something, was using that trail. The wild, untamed nature of the woods meant it wasn't a common route. It implied a need for concealment, a desire to remain unseen. Jed's jaw tightened. His solitary life had taught him self-reliance, but also a deep respect for unseen dangers. He knew then that his curiosity, now mingled with a burgeoning sense of responsibility for Dusty's strange compulsion, demanded further investigation. He would have to cross that river. The following evening, the new moon offered little illumination, casting the landscape in a deep, impenetrable gloom. The only way across was by skiff, a small, flat-bottomed boat Jed usually reserved for checking his fishing traps. He maneuvered it carefully into the chilly current, the creak of the oars echoing eerily in the stillness. Dusty sat rigidly in the bow, his ears pricked, his body a coiled spring of anticipation. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a prelude to winter's harsh embrace. Reaching the far bank, Jed secured the skiff to a gnarled willow root, the rope slick with river water. He then plunged into the dense woods, following the barely visible trail he'd spotted the previous day. The trees were a formidable, ancient barrier, their branches intertwining above, clawing at the darkness and forming a thick canopy that swallowed what little moonlight managed to pierce through. Every rustle of leaves underfoot, every distant hoot of an owl seemed amplified in the profound silence of the forest. Jed moved with the quiet stealth of a seasoned frontiersman, his senses heightened, his grip on his rifle firm but not white-knuckled. He was prepared for anything: a startled deer, a lone wolf, perhaps even a reclusive trapper's cabin. What he found, however, was entirely unexpected. After what felt like a mile, the trail abruptly opened into a small, irregular clearing. Jed stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing as they adjusted to the subtle contours of the scene before him. A makeshift camp had been cobbled together from rough-hewn branches, tarpaulins, and scavenged planks. A few rudimentary tents, little more than stretched canvas, stood huddled together. A dying fire, its embers glowing faintly like tired eyes, cast a weak, flickering light. Huddled around it, seeking what little warmth it offered, were several figures, men, women, and children. They were weary-looking, their faces etched with the stark lines of hardship and hunger. Jed watched from the deep shadows at the clearing's edge, his presence utterly undetected. He saw a young woman, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, gently tending to a whimpering child. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical, filled with a quiet, desperate resignation. This was no hunting party. These were people living on the ragged edge, forced into hiding, their faces mirroring a profound and desperate struggle for survival. Dusty, sensing the human presence, gave a soft, almost imperceptible whine at Jed's side. A profound wave of empathy, surprising in its intensity, washed over Jed. He recognized the telltale signs of destitution and profound struggle etched into every aspect of the camp. The threadbare, patched clothing, the gauntness of their faces, the hollowed eyes that held an age beyond their years, and perhaps most tellingly, the palpable air of quiet fear that clung to the huddled group like a second skin. These were not outlaws or vagrants. These were families driven to the brink. Jed knew, with a certainty born of his own solitary existence and deep-seated principles, that he couldn't simply turn away. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, he stepped out of the concealing shadows, his rifle held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed safely towards the ground. "Howdy, folks," he called out, his voice rough from disuse but carefully modulated to convey no threat. "Didn't mean to startle you." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The small, weary figures stiffened, conversations ceased abruptly. Eyes, wide with a mixture of suspicion and alarm, darted towards him from all corners of the clearing. Several of the men, their movements hesitant but desperate, instinctively reached for whatever they could find: a gnarled walking stick, a rusty shovel, a broken tool. The young woman Jed had observed earlier clutched her crying child even tighter to her chest, her body tensing as if to shield the child from an unseen blow. It was a raw, primal reaction born of repeated hardship and betrayal. Dusty, however, seemed to sense the underlying vulnerability of the group. Rather than mirroring Jed's cautious posture, the border collie took a tentative step forward, his tail giving a slow, uncertain wag. It was a small gesture, but in that moment of high tension it spoke volumes, a silent offering of reassurance. Jed knew he had to tread carefully, every word and movement crucial. He raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "My name's Jed Stone," he explained, his voice low and steady. "I live across the river on the Big Bend. My dog, he's been acting peculiar, always looking over here. Came to see why. I saw your fire. Didn't know anyone was out here. I mean, no harm." He paused, letting his words sink in, hoping his straightforward demeanor would cut through their fear. He knew the look in their eyes. It was the look of hunted animals, and his presence, no matter how benign, was just another potential predator. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension in the camp began to recede, replaced by a cautious, hesitant curiosity. Please subscribe to the channel to find out why these people are hiding in the woods. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the initial fear in the camp began to dissipate, replaced by a guarded curiosity. A gaunt man, his face etched with fatigue but his eyes surprisingly kind, stepped forward, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible burden. "We're just trying to find a bit of peace, mister," he said, his voice raspy with weariness and a hint of desperation. "We ran into some trouble back in Blackwood County." The name hit Jed like a cold gust of wind. Silas Blackwood, the notorious rancher, whose name was whispered with fear and resentment across the territory. Blackwood was a force of nature in these parts, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the landscape itself. He was known for his ruthless tactics, his insatiable hunger for land, and the brutal efficiency with which he acquired it. The gaunt man introduced himself as Thomas. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if recounting a painful memory. Thomas explained that Blackwood, with his army of hired thugs, had been systematically terrorizing small homesteaders and ranchers, forcing them off their land through intimidation, fabricated debts, and outright violence. He described how Blackwood's men would burn fences, poison wells, or simply ride in, guns blazing, until the rightful owners had no choice but to abandon their homes and their dreams. Thomas and the others in the makeshift camp were just a few of the many families who had been stripped of everything. They had fled their homes under the cover of darkness, carrying only what they could, hoping to find a place where Blackwood's long, menacing reach wouldn't find them. They had chosen this remote, densely wooded area precisely because of its inaccessibility, believing it offered them a last, desperate refuge. Jed listened intently, his expression grim. Each word Thomas spoke resonated deeply within him. He'd heard whispers of Blackwood's atrocities, but to hear it from the mouths of those who had directly suffered under his tyranny was different. It painted a stark, vivid picture of injustice. His heart grew heavy with a mixture of anger and profound pity. The plight of these people, desperate and vulnerable, resonated with Jed's own fiercely independent spirit and his inherent, though often unspoken, sense of right and wrong. He realized then that Dusty's nightly vigils weren't just about curiosity. They were about a connection to suffering, a silent plea that had finally led Jed to these hidden, broken lives. The dog, in his animal wisdom, had sensed their need, their quiet desperation, and had guided his human companion to a place where he was truly needed. Over the next few days, Jed's solitary routine was irrevocably altered. He returned to the hidden camp regularly, each visit reinforcing his conviction that he couldn't abandon these people. He brought what he could spare from his own meager supplies, sacks of flour, cured meats, dried beans, and what little medicine he possessed. He even managed to trade a few furs for some rough blankets and warm clothing, items that were desperately needed as the nights grew colder. During his visits, he listened more than he spoke, allowing the stories of their resilience and loss to wash over him. He learned their names: Sarah, a quiet woman with a perpetually worried frown; young Caleb, a boy no older than 10 who carried a surprising maturity in his eyes; old man Jenkins, whose gnarled hands shook with a palsy not just from age but from fear. Jed saw the raw courage in their eyes, the unwavering determination to protect their children despite their desperate, near-hopeless circumstances. They were not criminals, nor were they weak. They were simply people who had been wronged, people who had fought and lost, but who still held on to the fragile thread of hope. Dusty, too, seemed to have adopted the group. He'd often spend hours at the camp, accepting gentle pats from the children, offering silent companionship to the adults, his presence a calming influence. He would lie by the dying fire, watching the faces of the weary settlers, his eyes reflecting a deep, unspoken understanding. Jed found himself drawn into their quiet strength, their simple desire for a peaceful life, free from the shadow of Blackwood's tyranny. The thought of them being discovered, of Blackwood's men sweeping through this small haven, twisted Jed's gut. He knew Blackwood's reputation for relentless pursuit, and it was only a matter of time before someone, perhaps a hired scout, stumbled upon the camp. Jed had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, his ability to handle his own problems. But this wasn't just his problem anymore. These people, through no fault of their own, had become his responsibility. He looked at Dusty, who lay with his head resting on Thomas's lap, receiving a grateful scratch behind the ears. The dog's peculiar behavior by the river, his insistent vigilance, now made perfect sense. Dusty hadn't just been curious, he had sensed their need, their quiet suffering, and had led Jed, his human, to a place where his quiet strength and unwavering sense of justice could make a difference. The time for silent observation was over. The time for action was drawing near. Jed knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that confronting Silas Blackwood would be fraught with peril. Blackwood was not merely a ruthless landowner. He was a petty tyrant, a man who commanded a small army of hardened, trigger-happy thugs. His reputation for violence preceded him, and his reach seemed to extend far beyond the boundaries of his sprawling ranch. Yet the thought of these innocent families, living like hunted animals in the cold, unforgiving woods, constantly looking over their shoulders, spurred Jed on. Their quiet resilience had ignited a spark within him, a realization that some injustices simply could not be ignored. He couldn't stand idly by while Blackwood continued his reign of terror. The challenge, however, was immense. Jed was a man of the land, a rancher, not a general. He couldn't possibly take on Blackwood and his heavily armed men alone. He needed help. As he sat by his own fire one evening, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, his mind began to race, piecing together a desperate plan. He thought about the other small ranchers in the area, the homesteaders who, like the families in the woods, likely felt Blackwood's oppressive shadow looming over them. Many had probably suffered their own quiet indignities, perhaps even lost land or livestock to Blackwood's machinations. Perhaps they too were tired of living under his thumb, of being constantly wary, of watching their livelihoods slowly eroded by his relentless greed. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. These were independent men, accustomed to minding their own business, often wary of outsiders, and even more wary of getting involved in someone else's fight. But Jed had seen the fear in Thomas's eyes, the quiet desperation of the women, the wide, haunted gazes of the children. He believed there was still a spark of frontier justice, a shared sense of community that might be fanned into a flame. He decided he would ride out, not with a call to arms, but with a plea for solidarity. He would share the story of the families in the woods, their hidden suffering, and Blackwood's escalating tyranny. He would appeal to their sense of right and wrong, to their shared stake in a fair and just West. It was a daunting task, a journey into the unknown, but the hope of justice for the struggling families, a hope that had been born from Dusty's peculiar nightly vigil, was a powerful, undeniable motivator. He would try. He had to. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now to see if Jed can rally the other ranchers against Blackwood. Jed's ride took him through familiar yet now strangely somber landscapes. The rolling hills, the wide-open prairies, and the scattered homesteads that had once represented a peaceful existence now seemed to whisper tales of fear and oppression. He rode for days, often alone, sometimes with Dusty loping faithfully beside Bess, stopping at every isolated ranch and small, struggling farm he could find. He spoke to the homesteaders with a quiet earnestness, his voice carrying the weight of the story he was compelled to tell. He shared the harrowing tale of the families hiding in the woods, their desperate flight, and the chilling extent of Silas Blackwood's relentless greed and brutality. The reactions varied. Some were sympathetic, their eyes reflecting a quiet understanding of the family's plight, but their faces were etched with fear. They had their own families to protect, their own small plots of land to cling to, and the thought of incurring Blackwood's wrath was a deterrent too great to overcome. They offered their apologies, sometimes a bit of food for the road, but no promise of support. Jed understood their reluctance. Blackwood's reputation was well earned, yet with each refusal, a small part of him began to despair. Was he truly alone in this? Then he met others. Ranchers who, like himself, had felt Blackwood's pressure, though perhaps not to the same devastating extent as the families in the woods. They had their own bitter tales of Blackwood's men encroaching on their grazing land, of mysterious cattle rustlings, or of thinly veiled threats. These were men who had lived by their own rules, fiercely independent, but who were now tired of living under a constant cloud of intimidation. Slowly, painstakingly, a small but determined group began to coalesce around Jed. They weren't gunfighters, nor were they a trained militia. They were farmers, homesteaders, and small ranchers, men whose hands were more accustomed to plows and reins than to firearms in combat. But they were united by a shared sense of injustice, a quiet rage, and a deep-seated desire to protect their way of life and the innocent. They knew the risks were immense, that they might be riding into a fight they couldn't win, but they were no longer willing to be pushed around. In hushed conversations, late into the night around flickering campfires, they hatched a plan, a risky, audacious endeavor that would require every ounce of their courage and a hefty dose of luck. The storm, long brewing, was finally ready to break. Under the cloak of a moonless sky, Jed and his small, determined band of ranchers rode towards Blackwood's sprawling ranch. The air was frigid, biting at their faces, and the only sounds were the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the damp earth and the rhythmic creak of leather saddles. They moved with a stealth born of necessity and a shared understanding of the danger ahead. Each man carried a rifle, some old, some newly cleaned, but all held with a grip of resolve. Their plan was simple in its directness, audacious in its execution: to confront Silas Blackwood head-on in his own stronghold and demand that he cease his brutal persecution of the families hiding in the woods. They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Blackwood would respond with force, with the brutal efficiency that had become his trademark. But they were prepared to stand their ground, a small but unified front against tyranny. As they approached the main house, a two-story timber structure that loomed like a fortress on a slight rise, they could see faint lights flickering inside, casting long, distorted shadows through the windows. Blackwood would be inside, complacent in his power, unaware of the quiet rebellion gathering at his gates. Jed signaled his men to spread out, his hand cutting through the cold night air. They dismounted silently, taking cover behind a line of gnarled oak trees, a dilapidated barn, and a crumbling stone fence. Each man found his position, their rifles ready, their breaths misting in the cold. Dusty, sensing the heightened tension, stayed close to Jed's heel, his body low to the ground, his eyes fixed on his master. Jed dismounted Bess, tethering her quickly but securely to a low branch. He took a long, steadying breath, the icy air filling his lungs, steeling his nerves. He felt the familiar weight of his Winchester rifle in his hands, but he held it ready, not raised, a symbol of their intent rather than an immediate threat. He walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace towards the imposing front door of Blackwood's house, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of his own heart. He reached the heavy oak door, its dark wood imposing even in the gloom, and raised his hand. With a final, resolute breath, Jed knocked firmly, the sound echoing ominously in the quiet night. The reckoning had begun. The heavy oak door swung inward with a groan, revealing a hulking figure framed in the dim light of the interior. A burly man, one of Blackwood's enforcers, stood in the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun held loosely in his grasp. His eyes narrowed, taking in Jed's solitary, determined stance. "What in tarnation do you want?" he growled, his voice thick with suspicion and irritation at the late-night disturbance. Before the man could react further, before he could even consider raising his weapon, Jed's voice rang out, clear and steady, cutting through the silence of the night. "Silas Blackwood, we know about the families you've been driving off their land. We're here to tell you to leave them be." Jed's words hung in the air, a challenge thrown directly into the heart of Blackwood's perceived dominion. From the shadows behind his hired hand, Silas Blackwood himself emerged, his face contorted in a sneer that twisted his features into a mask of disdain and fury. "You got some nerve, Stone," Blackwood spat, his eyes glinting with menace. "Coming onto my property, making demands. You got no idea who you're dealing with." Jed held his gaze unwavering. "I know enough, Blackwood, and I ain't alone." As if on cue, the faint rustle of movement from the surrounding darkness signaled the presence of the other ranchers. Though unseen, their collective presence was felt, a silent but palpable threat. A tense standoff ensued. Words were exchanged, threats made, each man testing the other's resolve. Blackwood barked orders at his men to flank Jed, but a few warning shots from the hidden ranchers, whistling perilously close, made his thugs hesitate. It wasn't a large army, but their unified front, their unexpected courage, and the unwavering conviction in Jed's voice began to chip away at Blackwood's arrogant confidence. He saw not just Jed, but the spirit of the free West rising up against his tyranny. In the end, it wasn't a prolonged battle, but a sharp, decisive exchange of gunfire and a clear demonstration of collective will that swayed the outcome. Blackwood, facing an unexpected and unified resistance and realizing the potential for a prolonged, costly conflict that could expose his illicit dealings, reluctantly agreed to a grudging truce. He would leave the hidden families alone. Jed and the small band of ranchers returned to the woods as the first sliver of dawn painted the horizon, bringing news that brought tears of relief to the weary families. Their faces, once etched with fear, now shone with a fragile hope. They knew they had found not just allies, but true protectors in their time of dire need. Jed, watching Dusty happily reunite with the children who clutched at his fur with joyful abandon, felt a profound sense of quiet satisfaction. He had come to the West seeking solitude, a life untroubled by others' burdens. But he had found something far more meaningful, a community worth fighting for, a purpose that stretched beyond his own fence lines, and the quiet dignity of standing up for what was right. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed Jed's story, please subscribe to the channel for more tales from the Old West.